President and CEO. We've been in this building since January of 2015, and so this may be a new site at which some of you have come to speak to people about the International Institute. We're here today to talk about the Syrian refugee crisis and about international, national, and local implications of it. I'd at this point like to introduce Mayor Slay, who's known to all of us as a wonderful supporter of our immigrant community of diversity here in St. Louis, and he would like to welcome us and say a few words.
Well, thank you, Anna, and good afternoon, everyone. First, and I just want to thank you and everyone here at the International Institute for all the great work you do day in and day out in making St. Louis a much more welcoming place to foreign-born residents who come to St. Louis. You do a great job and certainly appreciate your experience and your expertise on this very, very important issue with the Syrian refugee crisis. It's also my pleasure to welcome to the City of St. Louis Jana Mason, Senior Advisor to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. Thank you for joining us today, and look forward to the remarks that you'll be sharing with us here this afternoon. The photos and the stories that you see of the Syrian refugee crisis compels all of us to act, to help people in need who seek to find a better, safer, and more stable life. The image of 3-year-old Syrian refugee Aylan Kurdi is haunting. His small body washed ashore in Turkey. Dreams of a better life drowned in the Aegean Sea. His story sparked outrage and a call for everyone to do more. And while our own efforts depend largely on the federal government, I stand here to tell you that St. Louis is again ready and willing to help. To date, through the International Institute and Anna's leadership, we have welcomed 29 Syrian refugees to St. Louis, and we expect 20 more in the coming months. Now there is a national initiative to increase the total number of Syrian refugees in the United States, and our city offers its help to resettle these and other newcomers to our city. It is the right thing to do. Many people have already asked how they can help, signaling that St. Louis is a welcoming and caring community, and we know we are. St. Louisans have demonstrated that when tens of thousands of Bosnian refugees resettled here, we held out our arms and welcomed them to St. Louis. Our city and our region is better because of them. They have built businesses, created jobs, rehabbed homes, revitalized our neighborhoods, and have become truly part of the fabric of St. Louis. And we're very, very proud to have such a committed and vibrant Bosnian community here in St. Louis. We have welcomed and supported them as fellow St. Louisans. It is clear from the recent outpouring of support from St. Louisans that together we stand ready to help again. If President Barack Obama calls upon cities to help resettle more Syrian refugees, please know that we will be ready to assist the International Institute in this effort. We need the entire community's support, so I'm calling upon all St. Louisans to join together in supporting this effort to help those who need our help. We've been there before, and we'll be there again. Thank you.
A few words about the format at this point. At this point, I'm going to introduce Jana Mason, who's the Senior Advisor for U.S. Government and External Affairs for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. She has a whole host of information, particularly but not exclusively about international issues having to do with refugees and how that potentially impacts refugee resettlement in the United States. Then I will provide some remarks about the local refugee situation and try to clarify some of the information that's out there, some accurate and some not. Then we'll have an open question and answer period. And then following that, we have two groups of individuals here that are available for interviews. And those are, and I will introduce them later, but let me just say that there'll be two individuals from the Bosnian leaders who will be here to talk about Bosnian efforts to be able to help with Syrian resettlement. And we also have representatives of 3 of the families that we have sponsored from Syria, Syrians who have come through Turkey, here available for interviews afterward. Please understand that in at least 2 of the cases they will be speaking through interpreters. Thank you. And at this point I would like to introduce Jana, who has some very enlightening information. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you, Mr. Mayor, for the wonderful welcome to St. Louis. Anna and I didn't plan it this way, but the timing of the press conference is very fortuitous because, as the mayor indicated, President Obama just today has directed the U.S. government to admit at least 10,000 Syrians in the next fiscal year, which starts October 1. Now, this is 10,000 out of what will likely be a global refugee ceiling of 75,000. So we're talking relatively small numbers, but it is clearly a first step. So we're here to talk mostly about Syrians, but I find that the numbers make a little more sense if you put them in a global context. So if you'll indulge me for 1 minute, I want to make just a few brief remarks about the global refugee situation so you understand the magnitude of the crisis. My organization, the UN Refugee Agency, releases every year global statistics. It's one of the things we do. And in June, around World Refugee Day, we released statistics showing that at the current time, there are more than 60 million people uprooted worldwide. These are the highest numbers on record, certainly since World War II, the highest numbers we're seeing. This is a global displacement crisis along the magnitude that we haven't seen in recent memory. Now, of those 70 million uprooted, it breaks down roughly to about, or of those 60 million uprooted, about 20 million are refugees. These are people who have crossed an international border and can't go home because they fear persecution. Syrians are among those. About another 40 million or so are what we call internally displaced persons, people who are still in the borders of their home country but have fled for the same reasons refugees do. Just to give you a sense of what that means, 1 out of every 122 humans on the face of the earth is uprooted, either a refugee or an IDP. If the refugees and internally displaced collectively were their own country, they would comprise the 24th largest country in the world. So the numbers of uprooted people are staggering. And the reasons for this are, there are multiple reasons, but the main situation we're facing is that old crises continue on and new crises arise. We're very familiar with the tragedy that's unfolding in Syria and Iraq and in other places, but we also still have large numbers of refugees from Afghanistan, from Sudan, now from South Sudan, a country that reignited in civil war just a couple years ago. Somalia, been going on for decades. Over 100,000 Burmese on the Thai-Burma border. Over 1 million uprooted Colombians still. So even though the cameras go away, these tragedies are still there. My agency and our partners are on the ground. So within these numbers, when we talk about Syrians, Syrians do comprise, without a doubt, the largest number of uprooted people right now. 4 million of them are refugees in neighboring countries, largely Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, the Kurdistan region of Iraq, Egypt, and elsewhere. Over 7.5 million, 7.6 million Syrians are displaced within the borders of their own country. So if you include the IDPs and the refugees, they are by far the largest uprooted population that we're dealing with right now. Many of you are aware of the tragedy unfolding across the Mediterranean and across Europe's borders as Syrians who have been in the host countries of Turkey and Lebanon and elsewhere are getting increasingly desperate and trying on their own to get across to Europe to try to make a better future. This is unfortunate because no one wants to be a refugee, and ultimately refugees want to go home. And what my agency and our partners do, and what we've been doing now for over 4 years, is protecting and assisting Syrian refugees in those neighboring countries. Those are the countries that, if you want to talk about numbers, those are the countries really bearing the largest burden of Syrian refugees. Lebanon is hosting 1.2 million Syrians right now. Roughly 25% of Lebanon's population is now Syrian refugee. Turkey is hosting 1.7 million. So you want to put those numbers in perspective when people start saying things like, wow, 10,000 people to the U.S., that's a lot. Try having 25% of your population be refugees like Lebanon. So we and our partners, which include non-governmental organizations, other UN agencies, we're assisting and protecting refugees, Syrian refugees, throughout the Syria region. But because of funding shortfalls and because those communities are really feeling the strain, some Syrians have chosen to undertake what is often very dangerous and tragic journeys to try to reach Europe and elsewhere for safety. We certainly call upon European countries to open their doors, open their borders, share the responsibility for accepting Syrians, but ideally no one would have to make that type of a journey. They should be protected and assisted in place. So now we get to the issue of resettlement. What UNHCR, my agency, does when we look at the numbers of refugees, our first solution is to try to help them go home when the situation allows. But as I said, and as it's clear, the situation in Syria shows no signs of resolving anytime soon. The second ideal solution would be to allow them to remain and integrate locally in the region. But because we're talking about countries like Jordan and Lebanon that have their own economic problems and political problems, they're not likely to offer permanent citizenship to these individuals anytime soon. So what we then look towards is something called third country resettlement. This is a solution that's vital, but it really is a small solution. For those refugees that are most vulnerable and most at risk, even in the host countries, again, all refugees by definition are vulnerable, but the ones who really can't stay in the host countries, maybe they were torture survivors or victims of trafficking or victims of gender-based violence, or a single woman with a large family. For whatever reason, if they're really at risk in those countries, then we look to the U.S. and other resettlement countries to take them in. The job of UNHCR is not to put them in any communities. What we do is identify those that are most vulnerable, and we refer them to countries like the U.S. at their request. We help identify those individuals, and then those governments decide who and how many they will admit. In the case of the U.S. government, every year the President sets a ceiling, and for overseas refugee admissions, the Department of Homeland Security actually sends people overseas and interviews refugees that we've referred and decides who will come to the U.S. So that's where we are at this point, and we rely very heavily on not only the U.S. government as a whole, but local communities, states, local government officials to provide those welcoming communities. Our job at the UN is finished once we refer a case, but we have a clear interest in seeing successful resettlement in local communities and open, welcoming communities so that we can continue doing our job. So it looks like St. Louis stands ready to be one of those welcoming communities, and we're very, very grateful for that. Thank you.
I want to spend a couple of minutes and talk about how the domestic resettlement program here in the United States actually works, because I think there's a lot of confusion about that. But in 1980, the Refugee Act of 1980, the U.S. government revamped refugee resettlement and how it's conducted here in St. Louis. There have been a lot of announcements lately that we have seen, for instance, from Europe. Pope Francis has talked about asking each of the churches over there to sponsor a family. We hear stories of individual families, in fact, lending out their spare bedrooms or their sofas, etc., to be able to assist the migrants that are making it to Europe, the refugees that are making it to Europe. That's not how it operates here in the United States. Because of the Refugee Act of 1980, at that time, what was implemented was a process that included a network of resettlement organizations, resettlement agencies, that had to have affiliates in particular communities in order to actually sponsor refugees. So, and this was in response to the large influx of Vietnamese boat people that occurred in 1979 when Jimmy Carter announced that 121,000 Vietnamese would be resettled in cities around the United States within a fiscal year. We participated in that program here in St. Louis. It was wonderful in terms of the lives that we were able to positively affect. We worked with a variety of faith-based organizations, et cetera, who served as sub-sponsors to us in order to be able to accomplish the goal. But it was hectic because there was no national process in terms of how to be able to conduct resettlement. So with the Refugee Act of 1980, then, these resettlement affiliates were developed. And here in St. Louis for a number of years, then the International Institute and several faith-based organizations, including Lutheran Family and Children's Services, Catholic Charities Refugee Services, HIAS, which came through the Jewish Family and Children's Services, we all sponsored refugees through our network. Over the years, those other organizations have closed their doors in terms of being resettlement organizations, and so the International Institute really remains the one contracted organization in St. Louis that can actually sponsor refugees. So, and we, by requirement of the federal government, receive a very modest stipend for each individual who's resettled. We help them find housing, get into English classes, help them find their first job, etc. And we work with numerous individuals in the community, both individuals and organizations, to be able to facilitate that work. You heard mention that currently the U.S. refugee program has a ceiling of 70,000 admissions for all refugees throughout the world. And so the issue with Syrian refugees then is to increase that ceiling beyond the numbers that are already being admitted, because we don't want to simply take people in need from other areas of the world who would benefit from having refugee resettlement and reallocate those numbers to the Syrian program. Of those 70,000 who are currently being distributed throughout the United States on an annual basis, we here at the International Institute have been sponsoring approximately 600 or 700 of the individuals. That's about what the capacity has been for the current resettlement program. So even though there is a desire to resettle more, there would have to be additional community input and services to be able to increase that number significantly. And to be able to increase it to 60,000, 70,000 numbers is, quite frankly, not realistic for our own local community here. Instead, if you were to think about it, if we were to, for instance, there are discussions at a national basis right now, the International Rescue Committee and other organizations are supporting expansion of the ceiling for Syrians of the Refugee Resettlement Program of another 65,000, which would essentially double the Refugee Resettlement Program in the United States. Well, those 65,000 are not going to all come to St. Louis because they're going to be spread around the United States the same way the first 70,000 are. And so logic would have it that here in St. Louis, because we would do our fair share, and even more than our fair share if we're able to do so, that we might double our resettlement numbers, and so we might well be at a potential capacity for 1,400 refugees. That's not an unrealistic number. There were a couple of points in the Refugee Resettlement Program having to do with Bosnian resettlement where the numbers were higher than that on an annual basis. But the higher numbers that we've heard talked about in the community would probably not be realistic because of how the refugees are apportioned nationally. They simply won't all end up in St. Louis. I've also heard recently a couple of conversations online and other places about, we resettled 60,000 Bosnians and therefore 60,000 Syrians shouldn't be a problem. People misunderstand. First of all, the Bosnians, we actually sponsored about 10,000 Bosnians over 8 years into St. Louis. That was the direct sponsorship into St. Louis, with the highest year in 1997 and 1998 of probably 1,800 Bosnians in each of those years. By then, the bulk of the individuals who were arriving, in fact, were mainly people who were family reunification cases. That meant they already had Bosnians in the community who were able to assist them with finding housing, getting them settled in the community, etc. And so there was a large volunteer network to be able to handle those kind of numbers. The balance of the people who are part of the Bosnian community here in St. Louis today, which numbers as much as 50,000 people, are number two, individuals who came to St. Louis later over that 8-year period as secondary migrants from other cities where they were initially sponsored. And we figure as much as half of that $50,000 number, that 50,000 number of Bosnians right now are actually American-born children of Bosnian refugees. So the actual core Bosnian community that was sponsored to St. Louis is really in the range of 10,000. It's not the 60,000 number that has been quoted around the community. And so that's also important to note. So we stand ready to do what we can, what the community is able to do to resettle Syrians, depending on what the president decides to do in terms of numbers. I want to say that I've been really heartened by the broad-based community support at this point for Syrian resettlement. Syrians themselves have a wonderful potential to be integrated into the community, and a decade or two from now being just as positive of residents as the Bosnians were in the 90s and the Vietnamese were back in the 70s and 80s. If given a chance, they can become part of the cultural and economic fiber of the community, and we believe that many St. Louisans understand that and are supportive of it. Let's go ahead and turn it over to